Hello, I'm John Klobuchar with InEight, and I'd like to welcome you to our latest webinar in our Project Cost Management series. Today's webinar is titled, Take the Pain Out of Project Execution Prep. Our presenter today is Rick Deans, who is Executive Vice President of Industry Engagement at InEight. In his role, Rick works with InEight's largest and most strategic customers to ensure they're continuously getting value from the use of our tools. This includes working with clients during the pre- and post-implementation phase. He also heads up InEight's Industry Advisory Group, which provides valuable feedback to the company around industry best practices and product roadmap validation. Rick was part of the original Hard Dollar team and has been working with InEight customers for over 20 years. Now, if you have any questions as you watch today's webinar, please submit them to webinars@ineight.com. One more time, that's webinars@ineight.com. Also, today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sending out a link to the video within the next week. Once again, we're glad you've joined us today. And now let me introduce Rick Deans, who will take it from here. Rick?
Well, thank you, John. Once again, I appreciate the great introduction there. And thank you, folks, for joining us. If this is your first time joining us for the webinar series, I think we've been providing some great content online. And if you're a regular attendee, we're thrilled to have you with us again today. Today's topic is going to be taking the pain out of project execution preparation. And if you've looked at some of the materials leading up to this webinar, we certainly empathize with the different pressures that we're under in the project controls world. So as we're putting an estimate together, we're getting final versions of the plans and the specs. Sometimes that's an iterative process, as we all know, that goes through engineering and design. Sometimes we're scrambling to get last minute quotations in from our subcontractors and our material vendors. And then as soon as we get the project awarded to us, there's hardly any time to put our feet up and relax, because we've got internal customers, our operations folks and our accounting folks, clamoring for budgets and field reports. And we've also got the customer wanting to know when we can actually break ground and start work. So we're going to talk about some of the things that we can do to sort of ease that pain. And like a lot of our webinars, we've distilled this down to a few salient points. So during this presentation, we're going to explore how to reconcile the level of detail required in both estimating and execution phases of a project. We're also going to talk about how to ensure that data collected during the execution phase of the project will come back around and feed seamlessly as benchmarks for new estimates. We're also interested in wanting to know what is the right level of detail to track specific work items in the field. We want to be able to communicate assumptions that we made during the estimating process. And we want to plan for a successful change management strategy. So again, we'll explore each of these in some level of detail. But first, I thought we'd talk about a few industry trends. So what are some of the trends that we're seeing? And I go out and visit with our customers, and I go out and visit with people in the market. One of the things that I'm hearing is the projects themselves are becoming much more complex for a variety of reasons. Certainly, there's the environmental issues that are included into the projects. It seems like they want things done faster and more cost effectively and safer than ever. When I say they, I'm referring to the owners. And they're also becoming more sophisticated in how they want data reported up to them. So we've got that vector as well. As we mentioned earlier, the project timelines are becoming much tighter, not only during execution, but also during the estimating phase. You know, we hear about a project and we've got a little over a week to put all this great detail together and submit a bid that you know our company is going to be putting resources at risk should we be awarded. And we're also seeing many contractors bidding for the same work. And then finally, the last point in here is that we're seeing a lot of alternative delivery methods, which I think is really healthy for the industry, and I think it's a great thing. But I talk to a lot of customers that this is the first time that we've done one of these, fill in the blanks. Is it a CM at risk? Is it a 3P sort of an opportunity? Is it a design build? So we're starting to see more and more of these different types of project delivery methods. And some of them, like design build, they're so commonplace anymore that I don't think it could actually be categorized as an alternative delivery method anymore. So the good news is that the technology is keeping up, and we're seeing some trends there as well. We're seeing more collaborative solutions. We're certainly seeing fewer one-off spreadsheets. These really ruled the day when I got into this industry 21 years ago. Everyone had their very specialized spreadsheet, and we're seeing less and less of that today, which is great. Instead, we're seeing solutions that are really built from the ground up for purpose. And this is a dynamic that we've talked about in some of our other webinars as well. Seems like the younger generations are coming up, and there is an expectation. 10 years ago, I would have said these folks grew up without having a computer in the house. Now, literally, we've got folks entering the job market who don't really understand what life is like without a smartphone, at least through their formative years. So that's an interesting dynamic. There is an expectation from this younger generation that folks are going to have tools, folks are going to have technology that are going to enable them to do a better job at what they're hired to do. So let's go back to our list of 5 things here, and we'll take a look at each of these in detail. So the first one is we're going to talk about reconciling the level of detail required during both the estimation and the execution phases of a project. So keep in mind, when we're putting an estimate together, we're usually under a different set of pressures than when we execute the work. So as an example, a common scenario is to make sure that all of our costs are covered. But during the estimating process, there might not be a lot of interest, for instance, in the phasing of the work, or the fact that some of the materials require long lead times. The focus is typically on getting accurate quantities and applying unit costs and unit man hours to those quantities to build the estimate up from the ground. And then we certainly do that discipline by discipline. We see a lot of our customers, have specialists or discipline leads that one will do the concrete, one will do the electrical, one will do the mechanical, one will do the steel, et cetera. And then there's usually some sort of a coordinated effort to consolidate these costs and man hours and determine the best staffing spread for overhead or indirect costs to complete the work in the allotted amount of time. So can we best account for this during the estimating phase so this work doesn't have to be done upon contract award? One strategy is to estimate the job the way it's going to be built out in the field. And this might be difficult if we have limited information during the preparation of the estimate, but if the work is familiar enough to us, we can certainly model out the project, for instance, by area or by phase as we're putting the estimate together. So let's kind of hop into the InEight estimate tool here, and we're going to take a look at this, what this might look like. Okay, so here I've got a project that, in the absence of a tool like this, the old school way of doing this might be taking a look at the client's bid items and then estimating each one of these as if it existed in its own universe, right? So I'm going to estimate what it's going to take us to do the mobilization, and then I'm going to estimate the clearing and grubbing, and then I'm going to estimate the excavation. Well, that might work really, really well, and it certainly achieves a purpose for putting an estimate together, right? We're going to understand what our costs are. We're going to understand what our resource requirements are. But then when we win the project, we need to kind of take that information, break it all apart, reshuffle it, if you will, and turn it into something that's actionable. One of the things our tools allow is to break the structure between the client's bid item list and the way we plan or the way we model the work. So in this example, this is the same project. It's just all I've done is I've estimated it based on phasing. So I've got a phase in here for project setup, another phase for different types of work, site prep, earthwork, underground utilities. I've got a phase in here for buildings and finishing, a phase in here for the roadways. And then each one of these can contain the necessary work items in order to satisfy the client's requirement for a bid proposal that spells things out relative to the way they want to see the pricing. So many of our customers will say, the client's bid item list, if we even get one, does not necessarily represent the most logical way in which we would build the project. So here I can model it by phase, but then I can assign back to each particular work activity the the pay item or the bid item that is associated with that work. So again, I can model it the way I want to. When I push this to the schedule, I'm going to get a nice kind of waterfall cascade looking schedule that is broken out by phase. And I can also help relate to my project people as well. So if we had some work that was going to span across phases, it's very easy to take that work and split it apart. So again, during the estimating phase, we're really focused on quantities and costs. Again, we talked about discipline estimating and then accounting for indirect costs. And then during the execution, we can focus on the phasing, the planning, and the productivity. And again, our key takeaway there is to see if there's not a way to model the estimate, but model the project as we're building the estimate. So again, some ideas there. You might be doing some of these. You might hopefully be learning something as well. So our second point here was to make sure that when data is collected during execution, that we can do something with that data. Certainly, we want to make sure the employees in the field get paid. Certainly, we want to make sure we're billing the customer for the quantities of work that we're doing. But, you could argue almost as importantly, if not more importantly, what are we going to do with that data when this project is over? Because we're going to have a lot more projects that are going to contain this type of work. One of the webinars we've done already this year is all about benchmarking and how to preserve that organizational history, and how, when I'm putting the next estimate together, I can rely on not only the way we've estimated these things in the past, but I can also look at actual field costs coming in from the field and see what it really took to perform this work. So there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. One way is to catalog the estimate, if you want to think about it that way. Some people call it codifying or coding the estimate. I like the term catalog. It sounds a little less intimidating. By using different data fields that are provided to really attribute these items or to assign attributes to them, if you want to think of it that way. The native names of these fields within our tools are typically account codes and tags. Tags are a way to label and organize things that we can use to subtotal and easily sift through an estimate containing many, many line items to find exactly what we're looking for. And then I think a key concept here is that this information will travel along with those work items. So since we are working hopefully in a database application, these code fields will travel with that work item, and we'll show some examples of that as well. They can even live behind the scenes in the execution system, so field personnel can focus really on recording the actual work they're doing. So as an example, it might be a lot more intuitive for a foreman, supervisor in the field to, as they're picking from a list of activities, hey, we're putting in the 36-inch RCP drainage along the roadway. That might be a more intuitive selection than memorizing some coding structure, right? So especially if they're set up hierarchically, these coding structures can now become the backbone of our organizational history for benchmarking. So I talked earlier about how this estimate can be put together by phases. There's another data field in here that I'll bring out. And this is called our account code. And you'll notice that I've created these account codes and I've assigned them at what we call the terminal level within our work breakdown structure. So I can very easily pivot this entire estimate based on these account codes. So let's just really quickly expand all of our levels here and see what it looked like. So there's a handy little feature in our tools that says drag columns here to group. I'm just going to grab this account code column up to the top. And I can see that now the entire estimate is organized by a coding structure. So I can say I've got some structural formwork, I've got some structural rebar, I've got a structural concrete pour, I've got some furnish and haul for my materials, I've got some laydown. And where these codes live is in a place called, in our system, it's called foundation setup data. So I'm going to navigate over there and we're going to take a look at the coding structure. And I think this does a good job of illustrating how these codes can roll up or be hierarchical in nature. So you'll notice I've got a code here, 2000 for all my earthwork items. And then you can see I've sort of divided those 2000 dot, 2000.10, 2000.20, 2000.30 for different types of earthwork. So I've got machine excavation, hand excavation, fine grading, spoils hauling. And even when we look at the concrete and the masonry work, I've first subdivided that into two main groups, concrete and masonry. And then the concrete stuff, I've subdivided into structural and flat work. And then I've got the same kind of breakdown underneath each of those. We're going to do some form work. We're going to pour some concrete. We're going to tie some rebar. So all of those can be coded individually. So when the folks in the field are actually tying rebar, they can say, today we tied rebar, and behind the scenes, the system knows there's a code associated with that. And it knows that tying the rebar for the structural concrete is going to roll up to my structural item, which is going to roll up to concrete, which is going to roll up to concrete and masonry. And as we're doing the benchmarks, that's really powerful, because one of the things we're going to talk about here in a moment is at what level of detail do we want to track things in the field? And it might vary job by job depending on where the risk of that project is. But if things continue to roll up to the next highest level and the next highest level, I can make some sense of all of this data, regardless of what level of detail it was estimated at, or at what level of detail it was tracked in the field. So again, having a good coding structure to support this hierarchy, I think, is a real key here. Okay, and then as we talked about earlier, you can also create values for tags. So tags might be things that we want to use to label our cost items, our resources, our pay items, our accounts even. So we can also assign different attributes to these items and create really limitless groupings like this. So it's the same $9.41 million. Earlier, I saw it by phase, which might be very attractive to our field personnel, but maybe my accounting folks really want to look at it rolled up by these cost accounts. Okay, and there's my same sum total of the project, $9.4 million, but here it's broken by phase. All right, let's go on to our next topic, which is really trying to determine the right level of detail to track specific work items in the field. Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier in the sense that where the risk might be in this project might be in a completely different set of items than where the risk was on the last project. And when we're talking about tracking items in the field, we really want to embrace that 80-20 rule. Certainly on unit price jobs like the one I just showed, it seems like 20% of those items are going to carry 80% of the cost of the project. And that's really where we need to focus our day-to-day. Sure, we're going to have a job site trailer, and we're going to be buying, pens and pencils and toner and copy ink and things like that. But those aren't really the costs that we want to manage and control. We're really looking at where we're spending most of our time, where we're spending most of our labor hours, what are the riskiest parts of this project. So we need to really understand that. And that's where a good communication loop between the office and the field really comes into play, because as an estimator, this might be the 14th project I've estimated in the last 6 weeks. And maybe I need to get some fresh eyes on this project, and maybe I need to go chat with one of the foremen or one of the supervisors in the field and say, hey, I'm looking at this new job. It's a lot like this last job, but the specs are a little bit different. And here's what's different about it. What do you think some of the things I need to really focus on should be? And you can get some great feedback from your own personnel that way. But, what is the right level of detail? A lot of times when we're putting an estimate together, we've got materials that are sort of nested into main items of work. So I might have a line item for furnish, install, and finish concrete. And so it's all wrapped up into one line item. And maybe it's really important for me to track the procurement or track the delivery of that material. Maybe it's a long lead item and I want to pull it out and have it represented by itself on the schedule. Okay, so there's a couple of things to think about there. What about indirect costs and project staffing costs? A lot of times we see these broken down into great detail in an estimate. I have a line item for a payroll clerk. I have a line item for a project manager. I have a line item for a QA, QC, person. I have a line item for a different type of inspector. So all of these are important during the estimating phase because we really want to capture our costs and understand the level of effort that goes into the project. But it might be impractical to track at that level in the field. Maybe I don't want to have a special line item just for my project superintendent and for my QA/QC person and for my payroll clerk. Maybe I just want to say today, all these people worked and we got a full day in out of everybody. So it's fairly straightforward to do that within our tools, and we'll take a look and see some options there as well. And this last one, take the guesswork out of where to track. So again, we might break things down to a great level of detail in the estimate, and we might not want to track it at that same level of detail in the field, or vice versa. Maybe we've got a single line item in the estimate. Maybe we're getting a quote from a subcontractor or from a material vendor, and it's just a single line item. But maybe in the field, that work needs to be staged. Maybe some of that work is going to be done across phases of our project, and we really need to know when that material is going to be delivered. Do we need a laydown area for it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we can certainly break things into more detail. So now we've been awarded this project. And one of the things that I always recommend customers do is and we're going to talk about this when we talk about change management as well, but there's an option in our tool to log our changes. So I've brought up the changes log. It's a new project I really haven't done much work in, but what this changes log is going to do, it's going to capture anything that affects the costs or the man hours of the project. So what's kind of nice about that is I can shuffle things around, or I can break things into more detail or roll things up to a particular level that I'm comfortable with. And that log will tell me if I've broken the budget at all, if I've modified things. So, you can see here in my pipe example, I do have a line item for furnishing materials. I do have a separate line item for installing the materials. I do have a separate line item for excavating and backfilling. If I didn't estimate it like this, I could certainly now take advantage of that prior to executing this project in the field. And there might be some costs, maybe this job overhead, I just want to be able to enter in against the main line item. I know that some part of that is going to be setting up the yard, some of that's going to be renting a trailer, some of that's going to be utilities. But again, I feel that these costs are relatively fixed. There's not a lot of risk. I don't expect a lot of variability. With these, I might just add incremental costs as we go along at this level or even at the highest level that there is. So a lot of different ways to manage as we're rolling this project out to the field. Another thing that's very helpful to us as well is a column that's called allow as built. So we use the term as built a lot. And what that allows us to do, and this requires a step up here in our job tracking. So we'll take a quick look at this. So the default setting is let me track where I want to, but now I've turned on this switch. And what this does is before I roll this project out to the field, I can say, I don't want anyone tracking at this phase header level. Instead, I want costs and quantities to come in at these lower levels. And so that's the way it's going to be set up for the field people. We get down into our mechanical package, and maybe I don't want to take about my stopwatch and my clipboard and my lab coat and try to understand how many hours someone is putting in feeder controls versus materials tanks versus blended material tanks. I just want to know, hey, they worked on process equipment today for 8 hours. So I would say, let's put our costs up here, but maybe I do, from an earned value perspective, I do want my quantities to come in. How many of these widgets did we install at each of these levels? Let that as a percent complete roll up to the next highest level, and then I can put my costs in here. So a lot of flexibility in terms of how you set that up. And again, once you've done that, as it rolls out to the field people don't have to use their creativity to figure out how to properly manage the project. It'll all be set up for them. Yeah, and just other considerations that we want to include in our analysis. We talked about the risk levels. weather, what constitutes risk. Maybe the lack of qualified craft labor. Maybe it's a seasonal thing, or maybe we're in a geographic area that doesn't have a lot of subcontractors, and we have to make allowances for making sure that they can get to the site and they've got a place to stay while they're out there working. So again, these are all variables that are going to affect our different levels of risk on the project. And again, I think a good rule of thumb is to look at each project individually and really try to determine where the risk is. I was with a company up in Saskatchewan, and they were sinking a shaft, and they had to bring in some cast iron cladding for the interior of this shaft, and they had to bring it in on one of those big Russian airplanes. That's the biggest airplane in the world. I forget the name of it, Asimov, I think. But that was interesting because they had to kind of get in line and wait for that plane to become available so they could get the materials to the job site. Now that would be something interesting to know about as you're putting the estimate together. All of this stuff was manufactured, I think, in Hungary. So again, different projects are going to have different levels of risk, and those risks are going to appear in different areas based on the specificity of those projects. All right, so now let's talk about communicating assumptions made during the estimating phase. So a basic estimate can be rather flat in that it may appear just to contain costs and quantities and maybe some productivity data. Our customers tell us they can enrich the estimate by capturing key details like notes, attachments, drawings, and links to key specifications all within the estimate file. And not only links to external documents, but even just the rich history of, for instance, having your quote management strategy all captured for you. Well, what does that mean? Well, I went out to bid for these particular items. These are the things that this particular sub was going to include in their bid. These are the things that I had to monetize. And I've got a nice track of who came in first, who came in second, why I chose that vendor. So when it's time to buy out the project, our procurement folks, if we're organized that way, have a great level of detail associated with what happened. So for instance, I'm going to go back into our tool, and I'm going to come to a part of the system called our quote comparison and award form. And here I've just simply filtered on one type of work. I've categorized some of the signage for this project, and I can see I really received 2 bids for this. One came in at $15 a unit. The other one came in at $16.30 a unit. And what's really cool about this is down beneath are these scope items. And what scope items are just things that we need to ask ourselves and ask our subcontractors if these are included in their base bid. So for instance, I can see that my first vendor here, that $15 a unit includes additional mobilization costs due to the phasing of the work. But his competitor over here didn't include that, so I needed to add some money. In this case, I chose $1,800. Also, was a survey included? Well, vendor B didn't include it, but vendor A did. And you can kind of see it does that analysis. So all these special conditions we can make sure we're including all of these little tick box items. And this is all recorded in great detail on the actual quote record as well. So I can get to the quote record right here. And again, I can see the line items that they quoted me. I can see, does this seller have a bond for the work? Is the seller insured? Is the seller licensed? Is there any sort of MBE representation certification happening? These are my scope items. This is where I put in the dollar amounts for those things they're not providing. I can also see the seller's profile, where they're located, any kind of notes associated with that particular vendor as well. So again, I'm not just handing over a number or a set of numbers. I'm really handing over a compelling package that tells a story in terms of how we went through this estimate. Some of the other places where we can look for that information would be, for instance, on the notes field associated with each of these line items. So don't get me wrong, we've got a very detailed estimating tool that allows you to specify a crew and a production rate, but it also allows us to put in some narrative as well. So let me just go back to my notes. And here they are. So this is a handy column. At first glance, I can really just tell quickly which items actually have notes associated with them and which don't. And if I did see that there was the icon that said this includes notes, I can see that the estimator here said, hey, there are 10 loads, figure mob in only. The next job will pick up the mob out. Added $500 contingency allowance in case extra permits are required. So you can see what that number really includes, what it doesn't include. And here we can see with the clearing and grubbing, it's mostly smaller trees and shrubs that can easily be hauled off. So again, all this great detail can really facilitate the handoff to the project personnel. So again, someone on the receiving end of this would actually see some of that narrative, some of that storytelling that goes into this. And obviously we want to flesh those things out as we have sort of a handover meeting. Everyone's structured a little differently. Some companies I work with, the estimator, they're with that project from the first incoming phone call to the final check. Others, there's more of a handoff associated with, I'm going to go estimate the next project. This is the team that's going to go execute this project. So regardless of how you're organized, clearly, I think there's a benefit in being able to have as much transparency as possible within the estimate. Another area where we can facilitate that is with what we call attachments. So this is pretty straightforward. I can, if I wanted to bring up a drawing, for instance, maybe this is the drawing for the floor plan of the toll booth that we're going to be building. Maybe there's a photograph I want to include. This is what the project looks like in January. So let's make sure we understand what sort of weather conditions we might run into. So any kind of job walk photos, plans, specs, drawings, those can all be attached either at the project level or as links to these individual line items within an estimate. And again, let's break away from thinking about the estimate in terms of just a bunch of numbers. This is really a compelling package that we can hand to somebody that can really understand what all went into building up that estimate. And now let's talk about, so again, as we're communicating these assumptions, we can talk about the crew makeups, the productivities, the notes, the attachments, the links to files, our quote history, and our fifth step, 5 out of 5 here, is really planning for a successful change management strategy. So those of you who have attended these webinars, you might have heard me say this before, or even anecdotally if I've led a workshop that you've attended. Every project has changes. And I used to ask people, has anyone ever worked on a project that never had any changes? Of course, nobody would raise their hand. And I was in the Middle East and I asked that question, and one gentleman who had been in the industry for 40 years, he raised his hand and he says, I still have the schedule on the wall in my office. It was the only project I ever worked on early in my career where everything went exactly as was planned and there were absolutely no changes. So I've done a lot of these workshops and I've been asking that question to rooms full of people, and probably out of 2,000 people that I've asked that question to, one person came back and answered that in the affirmative. So I think anecdotally, or if you want to really look at the facts and crunch the numbers, there's a really good chance that every project's going to have some changes associated with it. So what are some good ways to manage those changes? We know that they're going to occur. So what I really want to talk about here is really developing a comprehensive change management strategy. So you saw me earlier in the tool. I went and I clicked on and made sure that my changes log was running. And that's a good tool to use to just see if anything's changing in the estimate. Certainly, as we're closing out an estimate, that can be a very powerful tool, because as we're sitting in the room thinking, well, let's add this, let's add another person to that crew, let's add another piece of equipment to that spread out there, let's shorten up that duration, or let's add another day for rain. You can instantly see what that's doing to your project totals, and it's capturing each one of those steps. But now that we're actually going to go into execution, one of our best practice recommendations is to create an original budget. And what this is going to do, this is going to preserve all of those assumptions that went into that bid submission number. And then as the project unfolds, we're probably going to have a couple different categories of changes. So, you'll find that the changes will really boil into two main groups. There's going to be internal changes where we might decide maybe we're going to use a different construction technique, or maybe we're going to use a different set of materials or a different spread of equipment than how we estimated the project. Hopefully, if we've been attending these webinars, we don't leave anything out of the estimate. We've had a few different ways of looking for that, but sometimes we miss stuff. So that would be categorized as an internal change as well. And then there are external changes. What is an external change? Well, that's something maybe driven by the client, right? So I realize I didn't ask you to do this when you put your initial bid together, but can you give me a price for X? So we want to make sure that we're in a position where we can capture these changes. We can properly categorize or label these changes. And then we can report back to the client. Yeah, this is what we think it's going to cost you. Here's the justification for that. Oh, by the way, we've got 15 pending changes that need your attention. Either we're going to do that work or we're not. We need to know. And then we can keep track of those approved changes and those rejected changes and those pending changes. So very easy to do with the right set of tools as well. So I'm going to come over here into the execution section of our ribbon, and you'll notice there's an option here to create an original and a current budget. So this, as the prompt is going to tell us, we're going to lock in the original budget from the current estimate, and this can only be done once per project. So once I hit yes, it's going to create for me really a mirror of the project. So in this rarefied moment, I've got my current budget, my original budget, and my current estimate all aligned. So you can see the column totals. I've got 16,300 man hours, 9.410 million, 16.3, 9.410, etc. So these columns are my working estimate, my original budget, and my current budget as well. So that we use these acronyms: CE to represent the current estimate, OB, which is the original budget, and CB, which is the current budget. Now, what differentiates the current budget from the original budget? Well, the current budget is really that original budget plus or minus any approved changes. So let's go back into an item here, and let's just make a change on structure excavation. Let's take a look and see how this was estimated. So we're using a particular crew. We've got a particular productivity rate. So we thought we were going to be able to use our 245 excavator, a laborer, and an operator. And we thought we were going to perform at the rate of about 75 cubic yards per hour. Sounded reasonable until we hit rock. And now we realize, boy, we might only be able to do 20 cubic yards per hour. All right, so that's going to cause some changes in here. It's going to make my cost per unit go up considerably because I'm doing 800 yards. But now what I want to do is I want to take a look at what that would look like from a change perspective. So this budget contract changes register is really going to help me identify those things that have changed in the current estimate since I've locked in my original budget. So in this case, I'm going to ask the tool to create change records automatically to capture any quantity changes, man-hour changes, or cost changes that have been made to the current estimate. And it's going to sift through the entire estimate, and it's going to say, aha, this terminal item right here, structure excavation, is different. And because it's different, its parents are different as well. But we're going to focus on the terminal item where all the details are. And when I create this, I'm immediately brought to this header tab of this record. And there's lots of really cool ways I can identify this. I can throw some notes in here. So we talked about the importance of being able to capture some narrative. And if I go over to this details tab, if I double click on this row, it shows me exactly what the current budget is for that item, and then what the delta or what the total budget change is going to be. And it breaks it down by labor and equipment. And I can see the man hours. It's going to require another 59 man hours, and it's going to be $5,217. So again, when this record gets created, it's really in a pending state. So as I have more and more changes added to this, they're all going to come in as a pending change. And then what I can do is actually, I can approve this. So the ability to approve a change, I'm just going to come on over here and I'm going to approve it. And now it's been approved, which means that these values are now added to my current budget. So if I ran back to the cost breakdown structure, you can see my original budget still has 16,310 man hours, but those additional 58 man hours got added to my current budget, where they're now total up to 16,369. In addition, the additional costs were added as well. So now I can see what my current budget is for that item versus my original budget. So again, lots of different factors that are going to determine, is this something we just missed in the estimate? Are we responsible for the rock? Or maybe the customer should have known based on their geological studies that they had performed and the core samples that they pulled, that's something that they should be on the hook for. But in any event, I've got some good documentation when I attend to that meeting with the client and say, hey, we hit some rock. It's going to affect our productivity. Not only is it going to affect our costs, but there's going to be a schedule impact as well. And we can figure out the best way to resolve that. And I think a key part of the change management as well is to be able to label and link out to our document management system, out to other files that might be on a shared drive somewhere. And we can certainly do that within the changes register as well. So all of those, if there is an external documentation or a customer sign-off sheet that we want to make sure is incorporated in our project file, we have a way of doing that as well. Well, I want to thank you for attending. I hope you found it to be a great use of your time. And I also want to remind you that if you missed a webinar and you want to take a look at some of our recorded webinars, they're all up there online, InEight.com/webinars. And again, thanks for spending some time with us. We hope you enjoyed it. We certainly got a kick out of it. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick. To learn more about InEight as well as our project cost management solutions, visit InEight.com and click on the Request a Demo button. And if you'd like to see a schedule of upcoming webinars, visit InEight.com/webinars. Thank you for watching. This concludes our presentation.